Good afternoon. I'm Michael Markowitz. I'm director of the Institute for Retired Professionals. And I'd like to welcome you here to the new school, to the Institute for Retired Professionals, and to our very, very special Friday discussion series. We are committed at the IRP to representing one part of the new school's mission. That's educating the educated, helping the people who have educated deal with the world that changes and the changes in the world. And we've been very fortunate in being able to invite people who are provoking, who are provocative, and who help us think our way through new areas. And part of that is as a result of a gift we received to have these lectures by Marvin Tolkien, and Marvin Tolkien and Carol Tolkien are both here today. Would you stand up? 90 years. That's how long the new school has been part of the New York and the United States intellectual picture. It was founded to give people an access to education, people who would not normally be welcomed on campus at the time, so that women's studies, African American studies, had great impetus and great push from the new school, whether it was W.E.B. Du Bois speaking about black studies, or Margaret Mead talking about aging and how a community deals with its aging people. That's all been part of the new school's history. We welcome you to explore our piece of it, which is the Institute for Retired Professionals, in which students themselves are encouraged to develop study groups, to attend and run study groups, and students themselves are encouraged to make a commitment to lifelong education. Today's talk will be on a different end of lifelong learning. And in order to introduce the speaker and get to the speaker, I'm going to introduce my two wonderful chairmen of our special events committee. Where are you? I'm sorry, Miriam Lawrence and Gloria Troy. And I'm going to turn, who's right here. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Miriam, who will introduce the speaker.
Well, I too have a chance to welcome you all to the first Fridays at One program for the fall 2009 semester. And we're so pleased to have as our kickoff speaker Simon Critchley, the English philosopher and chair and professor of philosophy right here at the New School. Simon earned his doctorate at the University of Essex and has published widely on a wide range of philosophical topics. A small sample includes Continental Philosophy, a very short introduction for Oxford University Press, On Humor, which is an exposition and analysis on the meaning and importance of humor, published in 2002, Things Merely Are, Philosophy and the Poetry of Wallace Stevens, 2005, Infinitely Demanding, 2007, which provides a systematic overview of Professor Critchley's philosophical position, and of course the Book of Dead Philosophers, which is our topic today, published in 2008, which in 2009 became a New York Times runaway bestseller. And more recently, he has published on Heidegger's Being and Time in 2008, and currently Simon is working on a book called The Faith of the Faithless for Harvard University Press, which is due for publication in 2010. So today, Simon will talk about the Book of Dead Philosophers in a program that he titled To Philosophize is to Learn How to Die, described by the Daily Telegraph as profound and frequently hilarious. Critchley is an engaging and deadpan guide to the metaphysical necropolis, bracingly serious and properly comic. Please join me in welcoming Simon Critchley.
Thank you for that introduction, Miriam, and Michael too. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. And I was here a few years ago, and it's nice to be back. This, as Michael said, this institutions like the IRP represent what's best and important about the new school, and we need to hang on to that at all costs. We're not a normal university. Yeah? We're a decidedly abnormal university, and it's a wonderful thing. I'm going to go shout out to the adventurers and Rebecca Schiffman's father, who might or might not be. Oh, hello there. Hi. I just promised to do that to Rebecca. And okay, so I'm going to talk about this rather questionable book, The Book of Dead Philosophers. But let me begin in a slightly different key. In his 1827 essay on murder considered as one of the fine arts, Thomas de Quincey writes, De Quincey says, "For gentlemen, it is a fact that every philosopher of eminence for the past 2 centuries has either been murdered or, at the least, been very near it. Inasmuch that if a man calls himself a philosopher and has never had his life attempted, rest assured there is nothing in him." And against Locke's philosophy in particular, I think it an unanswerable objection, if we needed any, that although he carried his throat about with him in this world for 72 years, no man ever condescended to cut it. As these cases of philosophers are generally good, well composed, and little known, I shall here read an excursus on that subject, chiefly by way of showing my own learning. Evidently, unless I'm speaking to you from beyond the grave, or I'm a zombie, which is not impossible, no one has ever succeeded in taking my life. But even worse, no one has ever even attempted to take my life. This is proof, according to De Quincey's criterion, if proof were needed, that I'm far from being a philosopher of eminence. If, after this talk, some person or persons might be inclined to murder me and thereby secure my posthumous philosophical glory, I would like to thank them in advance, to vicariously shake them by the hand, to wrap them in a warm, virtual hug. One lives in hope. In the meantime, I'd like to turn to De Quincey's infamous essay on murder considered as one of the fine arts. Its literary conceit, as old as Cervantes' Don Quixote, is that of the found manuscript. It's the purportedly edited text of the Williams lecture on murder considered as one of the fine arts. The lecture was ostensibly read before the Society of Connoisseurs in Murder to honor the homicidal gifts of one John Williams, who brutally murdered 7 people in the East End of London in 1811, and with whom De Quincey was unduly obsessed. For the anonymous Williams lecturer, every topic, he says, like a chamber pot, has 2 handles. This is especially true of murder, which might be treated morally, he says, as a rather bad thing, or aesthetically, quote, as the Germans call it. That is, in relation to good taste. A great gallery of murder is then produced, exhibited by De Quincey, and pride of place is given to those eminent philosophers who have either been murdered or came close to being cudgeled to death or having their throats slit. Those are De Quincey's 2 favorite modes of dispatch, the cudgeling and the throat slitting. There are good examples of cudgeling in the history of philosophy. Boethius is one. But these are the stories that De Quincey tells. Descartes came within an inch of being murdered on a ship by a bunch of Friesland sailors who discussed his demise as if he were a puncheon of rum, De Quincey says. Spinoza was murdered in his bed by an assailant only known through the initials LM. Hobbes was not murdered, De Quincey says, although it is very true that a man deserved a cudgeling for writing Leviathan. Okay? Malebranche was murdered by none other than Bishop Berkeley, where the material cause of the Irish clergyman's wrath was a disputation about the nature of idealism. Leibniz was not murdered, but thinking himself such an excellent philosopher, he died partly out of fear that he should be murdered and partly out of vexation that he was not. Kant, a man who could not possibly look more like a mummy when dead than he had done alive, De Quincey says, narrowly escaped murder in the most bizarre of circumstances. As is well known, the good wives of Königsberg used to set their clocks by the hour of Kant's daily constitutional walk. One day, for reasons unknown, a man decided to murder Kant and lay in wait for him by the side of the high road where the peripatetic philosopher was sure to pass. But then for reasons also unknown, the killer preferred to murder a child playing in the road instead of the aged transcendental idealist. In this way, the throat... I'm using the mic, am I? What's it going to... I use two mics, or... Okay. In this way, the throat of the Moses of the German nation, as Hölderlin would have put it, was spared. Those are the stories that De Quincey tells in his lecture. Now, sadly, salacious and saucy as these murderous details are, almost everything De Quincey says is completely false. An utter fiction and confection. But the topic is fascinating and worthy of some consideration. How did philosophers die? How did they meet their maker, if there is a maker to meet? How did they singularly and generally expire? And what lessons might their deaths teach us about the nature of philosophy and the nature of what philosophy is meant to teach, which is namely a readiness for death? In my view, the true story of the deaths of philosophers is even stranger than De Quincey's fiction. That's what I've written a book about, and it catalogues 190 demises from the pre-Socratics, Thales, until some very recent figures. I have an epigraph, which is from the great French essayist, inventor of the essay, Montaigne, which in many ways describes the intention of the book. Montaigne writes, if I were a maker of books, interesting hypothetical, if I were a maker of books, he says, I would make a register with comments of various deaths. He who would teach men to die would teach them to live. Now, I want to begin, this is sort of the comical beginning, but the serious beginning, if you like, from a serious and simple assumption. What defines human life in our corner of the planet at the present time is not just a fear of death, but, I think, an overwhelming terror of annihilation. Well, this book was written in Los Angeles, by the way, which is part of the shadow of the light. Anyway, we could talk about that if you like. This is a terror both of the inevitability of our demise, with its future prospect of pain and possibly meaningless suffering, and the horror of what lies in the grave, other than our body nailed into a box and lowered into the earth to become worm food. We're led, on the one hand, to deny the fact of death and to run headlong into the watery pleasures of forgetfulness, intoxication, and the mindless accumulation of money and possessions. On the other hand, the terror of annihilation leads us blindly into a belief, sometimes, in magical forms of salvation and promises of immortality, offered by certain varieties of traditional religion and many New Age and some rather older age sophistries. What we seem to seek is either the transitory consolation of momentary oblivion or miraculous redemption in the afterlife. So I begin from this idea that what defines us in our corner of the planet is an overwhelming terror of annihilation. Death is the last great taboo. We are, as I try and put it somewhere else, anti-Victorians, in the sense in which the Victorians had a problem with sex, but no problem with death, and we're the opposite. As we're no problem with sex, we talk about it endlessly, and everyone has a right to whatever form of sexual expression they want, but death is sort of off limits. And that's what I'm trying to confront. Evasion and escape in relation to death. Now, in relationship to that initial thought, the ideal of the philosophical death has a sobering power.